Yeah, I
What are
didn't
we
think
talking
so.
about?
Old school paranormal investigation.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Um, so quick introductions. I'm Tally Johnson. I'm the moderator of this panel, and we'll go down that road. Everybody just say who you are, and we'll let the big tape do the rest. Dylan, you want to go next?
Hi, I'm Dylan Jones. I'm a parapsychologist in the UK, currently doing my PhD on paranormal media representations and how they influence paranormal investigators.
Josh?
My name is Joshua Cutchin. I am an author of what I like to tell people is speculative nonfiction, so they don't look at me when I'm saying they don't look at me like I'm crazy when I say I'm into UFOs and Bigfoot. So I write about paranormal topics, nonfiction.
My name is Alex Matsuo, and I'm a paranormal researcher and investigator. I've also authored a few books. I host a podcast. I've been featured on Travel Channel's Most Terrifying Places in America. I blog, and I'm always posting about the paranormal, so I'm really, really into it.
And to fill in mine, I write true ghost stories from South Carolina and tell ghost stories anywhere and everywhere for money. So before the panel, I was talking to Dylan. One of the things I had forgotten about was some of the Victorian era ghost hunters. Some of our illustrious predecessors used to carry weaponry on these hunts, on ghost hunts. I'm assuming that none of us have packed heat on an investigation.
I mean, you don't use hand-to-hand combat on a ghost hunt, guys? Like,
I mean,
I don't know what's legal. I mean, is it a solid shot, or can you use a shotgun? I don't know what the armament is to take down an apparition.
You know, at the same time, though, I have plenty of friends. It depends on what you're hunting. If you're hunting ghosts, I don't think it's very sensible to have a gun. But if I'm going to look for Bigfoot, you better damn well believe I'm going to be packing something. You know, don't want to be caught. I mean, you know, besides Bigfoot, you know, bears and anything else that might be out there, or just human beings, honestly.
Yeah, true. What about you? If you pack illicit heat over
no.
Definitely not. Definitely not. I know in sort of Victorian times, it was, take a couple of revolvers with you, pack it with some silver, and then we'll see what happens. And there have been a couple of cases, in the UK back in that era where, shots were fired. But I'm glad to say, not that I'm aware of in modern times in Britain, although it is pretty much on Supernatural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and when you couple that era's sort of the penchant that some tricksters had for dressing up as ghosts and going places, it's pretty deadly recipe. That was something that you don't see a lot of people doing now, dressing up as ghosts to scare people. But there was a whole pretty robust history from Spring Hill Jack on through to some other folks who were just dressing up and going out to terrorize people. So yeah, that could be dangerous, I would think.
Yeah.
It's not something we would encourage.
Yeah. I actually met a person who was trying to join my team, and he was trying to convince me how you can use tasers to subdue a ghost, because ghosts are electrical energy, and clearly you could use tasers, which were also electrical energy, and he didn't get on the team. I'll just say that.
I mean, it's not a dumb idea, but it's a dumb idea to tell someone. It's like if you want to experiment with this, that's fine. But that's not like you should put me on your team because I'm going to be packing heat. So you've got a friend there.
Yeah.
What about animals on investigations?
Yeah, that's one of the things. When you're at home by yourself, and it's like, I wonder if my house is haunted, and you just randomly zap the furniture. But yeah. We're going to the Carolina Theater in Greensboro, and I'm just going to start zapping the air at random.
Yeah,
I know.
Some poor custodian on the night shift gets zapped.
Yeah. That's a way to get invited back.
Right?
Yeah.
Wow. But what comes to mind for me when I talk about old school paranormal investigation is somebody like Carrie Price. who's probably one of the spiritual fathers of all of this craziness, because I think he did some work on some of the ABCs even before World War II. Dylan will probably correct me on that, but I know he did Borley.
Borley
And
Rectory.
yeah, and one of the best known that I've come across in 3 or 4 different books is his kit, and he includes things like felt covers for your shoes and chalk for chalk circles. And question for y'all is, what kind of old school techniques do you use when you're on an investigation? And I know, Josh, you're not necessarily doing indoor things. Oop.
Oh.
Internet.
We lost Josh.
I expect he'll be back. Probably the joy of technology. But yeah, what I was asking is, what kind of old school gadgets do y'all have in your kits? We were talking about Harry Price, Borley Rectory fame, and using some of his like felt shoe covers and things like that. And Josh, I was saying, I know you don't necessarily do interior investigation so much, so I'm really interested to hear what you do as far as the old school stuff.
Well, one of the things that I think is important is this is sort of old school in a way, is to sort of rely on your flashlight less, to really sort of give yourself a chance to have your night vision to really catch up with where it should be. That's one thing. Something that if I did more inside investigation, something that I think is really underutilized nowadays, that I think is still a great way to catch stuff, is to put out talcum powder. And I just put powder on surfaces and to see what you get. That's something that I don't think a lot of people really use, that I think is still a really good technique. But the other thing is really trying to find creative ways to use your environment. Finding ways to give yourself a better field of view. Something that I've done with some friends is, instead of, again, this is a low-tech thing, but maybe not necessarily an older technique, but it's a low-tech thing that people can do, is instead of, both looking in the same direction, standing back to back, so that, nothing ever sneaks up on you. But yes, but standing back to back and sort of describing things that you see, and then if you see something that needs to be seen, then call it out to the other person. But
yeah, that talcum powder thing is interesting, because I had a relative who shall remain nameless, who was having some issues at their place, and I used talcum powder because one of the issues was a phantom cat jumping from a chair and making the chair move. And using the talcum powder, sure enough, I got little cat footprints and slide marks in the stuff. So yeah, I can vouch for that. That was a really, really good idea.
It's good and simple, and anybody listening can do that right now.
Yeah, and grab a wet wipe and clean up your mess when you're leaving. Yep. So, Alex, what about you? I know y'all go all manner of places.
Yeah, so I'm not a huge fan of modern tech in the first place, because I think it's exceptionally faulty, whereas talcum powder is more reliable. But something else we also do is we do take really copious notes, so just like a pen and paper, but we also sketch. This was actually inspired by Harry Price. I draw the floor plans of the location and I make maps. So basically, and I distribute it to my team members, and I have them mark where they encounter activity. So, and then, because depending on how long we're in the location and I'm able to do it, I'll have like my psychics do a walkthrough and they'll sketch out what they see, because most of them are visual anyway. So getting a visual helps. But they'll also mark where they feel things, and they won't show each other their paper. And then we basically compare the maps and see like, okay, well, if there's any consistencies there, then that's interesting. And oftentimes there have been, and other times there hasn't been. So, but we'll take that into consideration. Sealing off doors and windows and stuff, that helps too, because drafts and all that good stuff. But Yeah.
You know, it's funny, Alex, that you say that, because I said a while back that this is a little bit, maybe it's an unrelated tangent, but I feel like every ghost story is like only half about the supernatural and the other half is actually like an architecture story. Because like the layout of the house has so much to do with what you take away. And but to your point about not using modern tech, I feel like a lot of the modern tech that we get is so much more prone to producing results of pareidolia than a lot of just the older common sense stuff. You know, the more technical you get, the more opportunities for things to fail and for you to sort of graft stuff on that's not really there.
Yeah, it's also, a lot of it's built for entertainment purposes. Like literally, the product description will say for entertainment purposes only.
Just coming on that point as well. The way I look at it as a piece of equipment in the modern sense is that, and I use a policing analogy from when I was a police officer, that if you were to be stopped by a police officer for a speeding offence and they had the speed gun and they clocked you on it, you would want to know, is that person trained to use it? Do they understand the theory behind it? Do they understand the practicalities of it? Is that piece of kit able to be calibrated? And you have this checklist of going through, because if you wanted evidence, that would be the way you would get it. Now, when you look at an EMF meter, why are they using it? Do they understand how to use it? What's the theory behind it? And I bet you if you ask them these questions, they will not know why they're actually using it. And I would go back to what Alex had just said about the paper, the pen, and a torch, in case you are there in the dark. Because that is basically what you were looking for as a human experience. First thing is you should be having an interview with a witness. So you're going to be making notes. And you're going to keep going back to those notes and evaluating all the time, making your sketches, your plans, your note-taking. And a police officer will tell you this, or an investigator for anything. Your notes are what you come back to all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the best things you can have. As an author, you're writing things down. That is the best piece of evidence that you can have.
That's an excellent point, Dylan. I mean, as somebody who's pursuing higher learning in this, in something like parapsychology, I mean, you realize that it really is a fool's errand to try to take human beings out of the equation. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, isn't heard. And I think in the case of a lot of these phenomena, I mean, it's less likely to happen unless you have some sort of foci, some sort of focal point. That's just my 2 cents.
Well, and even with the modern, go ahead, Tally.
No,
Sorry.
go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, even with the modern tech, I feel like that is detrimental to the ghost hunting world in a sense, because these investigators are looking down at a screen the whole time. Or they're looking at the red light in the room instead of having that experience. So that was something I've noticed too when I investigate with other groups, and they're constantly looking down at the screen, and I'm like, look up.
Well, and something else, if we're going to accept a lot of these phenomena as fact, as objective realities, not enough ghost hunters talk about the fact that they might be influencing the results from a ghost box or something. They assume that it's exteriorized, but if anything about parapsychology is, demonstrably true over the past 50 or 60 years, it's entirely possible that you might be the one getting those answers back. You might be the one projecting into this piece of tech or whatever. Whereas I feel like you might be a little bit less likely to be the cause of that moving shadow over there. You might be projecting your own influence onto this randomized series of words that are being spit out by a radio going through static.
Well, it's one of those things where
In that case, throw it all away.
Yeah.
Well, it's like when you watch the shows on Travel Channel and all that stuff, they always have the evidence reveal, and they always play it live, and it's like that could be anything.
Yeah.
And then they come back to the big reveal for the client, and oh yes, he said George Clooney. And when they play it back real slow, amplified to 50,000 decibels, oh yeah, it sounds like George Clooney because you've told me it's George Clooney. So therefore, I'm listening for George Clooney.
Now I want a ghost to say George Clooney. Thanks, Tally.
You're welcome.
Wait, raise the standards.
But and part of this is the joy of poverty too, because I don't have the money to go out and buy good equipment like the ghost boxes and the EMF. So I have had to rely on tape recorders and now digital recorders on the phone for notes and whatnot, pens and paper, torches. And I think that, like we were saying, I think it puts you more in the moment that you can have an experience and you can react to an experience if someone you're with has one. Because we all know, and it's not one size fits all. I may have a auditory experience, but Dylan or Josh may have a visual, and then Alex will have the auditory or something. So there's really no rhyme or reason. And if you have your head in a meter, then you don't have a clue. And like Dylan was saying, do they know how it works? You buy them on the internet for nothing, and then I can push buttons and I can make noises.
We've become attracted, we've become addicted to the allure of the trappings of science, because it looks like you're being sciencey because you've got a piece of kit in your hand. It's like Egon walking through the library with a PKE meter. It looks like you're doing science. And sadly, it's not, because what you're there to look at is the human experience that somebody has reported to you. They weren't waving a PKE meter or an EMF meter or anything when they had the experience. They were probably sat down, they were probably reading a book, doing something completely mundane at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, not trying to stay awake all night looking through night vision to try and see something.
And I would argue in sort of a George P. Hansen trickster sort of vein of thinking
George Hansen. Yes.
that maybe even the fact that you have advanced tech there is decreasing your likelihood of catching something legitimate. The self-reflexive nature of this. Dylan, I see all this Ghostbuster ephemera behind you. I wonder, do you think that's where this fetish, this tech fetish, really sort of originated in ghost hunting circles?
There is an element, I think, to it. It's certainly, there are programs you see now where the emergency response, we've got one, press the buzzer, let's get out there, we've got to be on call, we've got to be seen to be like that, we've got to have the equipment, we've got to provide
our cars.
Yeah. There's lots of things there, but I think, there are other television shows which have helped towards that, but that's purely what my PhD is going to be on, is how much it has affected and whether I can prove that there is a link or not.
Well, I think part of it is we have to prove the hauntings are real. We have to prove we have to prove Bigfoot exists. We have to prove ghosts are real. And the way we do that is we've taken on the trappings of the skeptics. So we have evidence. Well, for 200 years, or at least 100, the story was your evidence. People reported seeing, experiencing whatever it was. That's what we had to go on. And that's one thing I find fascinating about going to places like the old jail in Charleston, South Carolina, because it's been hunted to death because everybody goes through with their gadgets and whatnot. And I'm like, do y'all even know the stories that are supposed to be happening here? Because none of you seem to be, y'all are so worried about the gadgets and all.
See, it's interesting to me because I don't see this sort of obsessive preoccupation with modern day tools and technology in UFO hunting or Bigfoot hunting. I think that's because there's a certain reliability baked into hauntings, or at least there's a perceived reliability in terms of it being a fixed place. Like it's a building, and this happens. Stories say that this happens in this room, and so it's almost like instead of trying to coax the phenomena to show itself, it's almost like this sort of tacit assumption that it's going to be there, and all we've got to do is just capture it. And I don't necessarily know that that's a great approach. it almost seems like maybe a sort of false sense of security in terms of ghost hunting. This idea that like this is on call, but in truth, these things are repeatable, but not on demand. To coin a phrase of a friend.
Yeah. I had posted a image on my page today, basically said, will we ever prove that ghosts exist? And I posted it in a few different groups because I was honestly really curious, like what is proof to people? And some people said, well, we've already have proved it. And I'm like, well, how did we do that? And then they'd say science, and then they'd link me to their YouTube channel. And one of them was a video of like, the Kinect SLS camera. And I'm like, do you know how this works? And they couldn't really give me an answer for it. I said, do you know what the hardware is supposed to do? Do you know what the software is supposed to do with this? And they couldn't tell me. And the information's out there. I mean, Kenny Biddle wrote a really great piece about that and basically debunked it. And I had a few other people send me their YouTube channels like, this is the proof of the paranormal. And it's all based on tech. And some of it was like radio sweeps, and I'm like, well, how do I know that's the ghost? How do I know that's not Cardi B, sweeping through there right then? If you hear a but so you're right. I think it is a false sense of security where it's like, well, we got it on our tech, so it must be valid and legit.
And the thing that I think those of us who are interested in these topics, spend so much time railing against the people who use coincidences as a lazy excuse that we forget that sometimes coincidences do happen. Sometimes you do get a very fortuitous word that comes across. You do get Cardi B. Sometimes that happens. But we spend so long sort of railing against these people who are just being dismissive that we forget that coincidences are still a real thing that happen in all these research endeavors.
Well, like I say, one of my pet peeves as far as new tech is camera phones. Everybody's got one. The quality stinks. They're worse than the one I'm using now. But everybody I have evidence, and let me show you on my phone. I've gotten better results using old school black and white film and Polaroids. I actually, at work, they got rid of a Polaroid camera and had like a stack of film cartridges for it. That's what I use now when I go places, because I figure that 20 snapshot exposure is probably more reliable than doing a big burst of things on my camera phone.
Well, and these digital cameras have so much artifacting and all sorts of other garbage in there that it's easy to find stuff where there isn't. The level of fidelity of something like an actual film camera is just always so much better.
Yeah.
These are brilliant points. Going back to the old school ghost hunting.
Yeah.
What I wanted to think of was who was doing the old school ghost hunting. What kind of people were doing it? And when you look at Victorian times, it was very much a gentleman's pursuit.
Charles Dickens, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Exactly. Yeah. You had those kinds of people of a particular social standing, a particular educational standing. And when there's Dr. Leo Rookby, he's based in the UK, he's a sociologist. He's been looking at how it was done who did it back then and who does it now. And who is doing it now are your average working class people. And I've been looking at some research for my studies, and it's who watches reality television? Working class people. Is there a connect between what they're watching on television now and those kind of people are taking up the mantle of being the ghost hunter? And do they have the knowledge and the ability to be able to go and do it the way perhaps it needs to be done and should have been done?
I partially wonder too if there isn't some sort of correlation between not materialism in terms of the physicalist paradigm, but materialism in terms of like being greedy and wealth. If there isn't some sort of correlation between, the upper class today is so much more wealthy than the rest of us. They don't need to worry about the afterlife or anything. They've got other things to preoccupy themselves. Whereas in an older generation, it was sort of like, you know, it was sort of like they were more concerned with. I get the impression that, of course, I see that the inherent failings in thinking this way, but I get the impression that the educated upper classes of yesteryear were perhaps a bit more curious than the upper classes that we deal with today. I think that might be part of it too. I think that, you know, that's just my 2 cents. Alex, you probably have more insight on this than I do.
Yeah, I agree. Because I've actually have been looking at the demographics of people who watch these shows, because honestly, they're my target audience. If speaking from a branding and marketing perspective, so trying to understand where they're coming from and where they get their education from. And you know, this is no offense to anybody, but I've noticed that a lot of the really passionate folks and the ones who are really putting themselves out there, I mean, they usually have a high school education, GED, usually men, white men, I've noticed, religious, conservative. And then you have the other side of it where you have it's the housewives. The housewives who are watching the shows, and it's also from experience standpoint with my team and such. A lot of the ones who are having these experiences are housewives when there is a haunting, because they're the ones who are home. And the husband's usually like, you know, I guess there's something here. I don't know. I don't know. I don't think there is. Because a lot of our clients are wives. They're housewives. So I think, and I don't know why in particular, but also this demographic is very spiritual too. And I think that stems from the religious upbringing. You know, especially with the mindset that ghosts are demons. A lot of times, if we're coming from the conservative Christian realm, which a lot of it is, because I mean, I grew up in California. I mean, there was a few ghost hunting teams, but then when I moved to North Carolina, I was like, oh my gosh, there's a ghost hunting team. Like I can toss a rock and hit one. And so I think that makes a difference too. It's got a lot to do with demographics, where you grow up, and just looking at the analytics of like who buys my books and my website. I mean, it's middle America, it's the South, or the north, like rural, like Pennsylvania for some reason. Well, no, I know why. So I think that's what a lot of it has to do with it, and it's almost like almost a shift. But then you have folks like Dylan and you, Josh, and Tally, who kind of go against that trend, but we're also not really the ones going to speak at, like, you know, Scarefest and
Right.
that kind of thing, you know?
We're not cool enough. We're not Zach.
We're
Women's
I
trying
can
to
hear
get me in
Tally twitch from here.
trouble.
I think there might be a left brain, right brain thing going on here too. Like you look at the people who are most likely to be wealthy, but least likely to be famous, and they're all people who deal with, you know, these concepts of running you know, a corporation that I could never wrap my head around, or who do, you know, math that I could never wrap my head around. Really dry kind of, not there's there's less creativity in there than there is with something like you know, a producer of any type of art. And you know, these phenomena tend to sort of cluster around artists, I think. So that might be something too, is the way that we as a culture are rewarding these sort of more analytical occupations than we do artistic endeavors. I think that might have something to do with as well with that class divide.
Well,
Interesting
my
topic.
thinking is, oh, sorry, Josh.
No, it's fine.
My
No, you're good.
thinking is that a lot of the problem we have now is talking about, we don't talk about the Victorian era folks. We don't have any more polymaths. Everybody runs on their rails. Basically, I'm going to do STEM. I'm going to do arts. I'm going to do, and there is none of this. Well, I like math, but I also like to read high fantasy or romance or whatever. I mean, if you like math, I'm going to read tech manuals. I'm going to read Scientific American. I'm not going to read 40 Times. And I think that's another thing that we've lost, is the over specialization in daily life, I think it's carried over because now, like Alex was saying, everybody's a ghost hunting team.
Yeah.
No one cares about folklore. No one cares about cryptids. It's ghosts because, well, all the shows on Travel Channel are ghosts.
And I think a reading of any one of these topics, I mean, like you said, the ignorance in terms of folklore, I mean, that's one of the richest veins that I keep on coming back to. Is there's so much stuff that we run into that we can't explain, but there's at least a precedent for it in folklore, and we see that. So basically, what you're saying is we need more Micah Hankses. Because Mike is one of those guys who's just like a complete, he's an autodidact, but he's also a Renaissance man as well, and he's interested in this sort of stuff. But yeah, that's interesting.
Well, going back to the artist point that you brought up, Josh, there was a study done. I think it was ASPR. They did the Gonsfeld experiment on Juilliard students, and I'll send you all the PDF of the study. It's actually really fascinating. They did the Gonsfeld experiment, and they separated by like actors, musicians, and dancers. And I want to say they had a lot more hits with the musicians, which was interesting. So they found that artists are very they're more prone to hits with the Gonsfeld experiment. And I actually also did some research on a study. Well, Fiona Shaw, the actress, she put herself through an MRI while she was reading while reading a Tennyson poem. But then she'd do like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, like just do something very basic and stagnant. And then she'd start acting, and they were tracking like what part of the brain was activating. And they found that the visualization part of her brain was activating. Going off of that, it's also a similar part of the brain that activates when people are having, or psychics, self-proclaimed psychics, are doing their readings. So
I would suspect that is not inconsequential. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. I'll find it. I'll send it to y'all. It's actually with the Gonsfeld experiment on the Juilliard students and the Fiona Shaw MRI. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Cool.
This is what we do when we geek out.
Dylan, what old school technique do you want to make a comeback beyond just ditching EMF meters and ghost boxes and that kind of thing? What piece do you think we're missing as modern investigators, for lack of a better term?
They don't read.
As an author, that hurts my feelings, but you're not wrong. And
I think I would ask any of them, and this might be one of the questions I might ask in the groups that I'm going to be observing and interviewing. Have you read Lloyd Auerbach? Have you read Peter Underwood? Have you read Harry Price? Have you read Steve Parsons? Have you read, and just these lists of people? And I don't think it's the modern way is to pick up books and read what's gone before. Before you even get to the stage where you start setting foot in a haunted location, and then just paper and pen.
This is an absolute epidemic in the UFO community. I was active on Twitter for a while before UFO Twitter. I got some vague death threats. That's not a conversation to be had right now, but just the general lack of education. It's like, not to say that you can't learn good things from YouTube channels. There are plenty of great YouTube channels out there, but like that's people's go-to. And I'm like, well, have you read all of Valet? Have you read all of Keel? Have you read Patrick Harper? Have you read George Hansen? Have you done any of this sort of basic legwork so that we can actually engage in the same level of conversation? And 9 out of 10 of them don't. They just they not only reading, I think it's a really good point, but also people don't read things that they disagree with. That's a huge problem too. Reading things that you just to be able to process that and to be able to make up your own sort of apologetics for your own position, I think is a really important skill that a lot of people don't have. So not only do they have an ignorance of what's come before, and again, I've been accused of sounding elitist for saying things like this, so it's sort of relief that you said that, having a sense of the foundations of what's come before, what's been tried, some of these thoughts that people have, but also, again, challenging your own beliefs with stuff that you know you're going to disagree with. I read plenty of skeptical blogs because I want to be firm in my assessments. And sometimes, sometimes the abyss is also, and you're like, wow, that's a really good point. But most of the time, it really does help you work through your own, I hesitate to say beliefs, but your own conclusions to have them to self-challenge. I think it's an excellent point.
I think going on what you said, I think it's wonderful that people are interested in the paranormal and want to study it. Fantastic. But we have to temper that enthusiasm with a bit of grounded realism. We admit we have all made mistakes. Back in early 2000s, I was guilty of picking up an EMF meter and a negative ion counter. And it was only when I applied the sort of police thinking to it, hang on, I'm not trained to use this. Why am I using it? Oh, and I put it down. And it's admitting and telling other people, look, I was wrong once. It's okay to be wrong. That's how we learn.
Our culture isn't okay with saying that you admit that you're wrong, though. That's another problem too.
Exactly.
And healthy debate as well,
I think not reading is critical, because I've had folks correct me about stories that I've told in books, told in person. And I'm like, well, did you have an experience? What? No, but a friend of mine watched it on YouTube, and that's not where that happened and stuff. And I'm like,
right.
Okay. Let me take you to the library and let me show you the 14 books that I used. And they're like, you use books? And I'm like, yeah, they're amazing.
Not just books, but newspaper articles, like from actual publications. Because I can't tell you how many, and y'all know this, but I can't tell you how many times the history of a haunted location is incorrect. Because they're trying to sell a ticket, and then you go through like the newspaper articles, and it's like, oh no, this isn't actually what happened. It drives me nuts. And what's happened with Tally has happened to me numerous times. Like, I did a blog and a video about Courage the Cowardly Dog, because there was a meme going around in the paranormal community that it was based on a true story. And so I just took the little tidbits. It was huge on Reddit and the paranormal Reddit and stuff. So I just
we all know paranormal Reddit's infallible, right?
Oh my God, paranormal Reddit is like the most toxic cesspool ever.
Yeah.
Now I'm probably gonna get death threats after that. But so I just did some research, and I actually found the couple that the meme was talking about, but they didn't even have a dog; they had a cat. But then I found this whole other thing that was super fascinating. Like, they really did disappear without a trace. And I'm like, well, that's an interesting story. Why don't we tell that story? So nothing to do with Courage the Cowardly Dog, but it sent me down this rabbit hole of like, was this espionage? Was it murder? Like, it sent me down this whole other path. But I had people correcting me on it. It's like, no, they had a dog. And I'm like, I'm literally looking at the local newspaper from New Mexico, from the sheriff's quote saying they had a cat. I'm literally looking at it right now. But this meme I saw said they had a dog. It's like, okay, so let's believe the meme then. Like, come on.
Yeah. So. Yeah. The wiki rabbit hole and the Internet Archive rabbit hole and the Hattie Trust rabbit hole and the library rabbit hole are horrible, horrible things, because research is your friend until you start to overdose. And that's a bad way to be. Well, I've done Dylan saying be up at 3 o'clock in the morning to do something productive, and then it's like, oh wait, and I look up and it's 4. That's not good.
Exactly.
That's me in Ancestry.com when I'm doing genealogy research, which I do for my paranormal research. So I'll start at like 10 a.m. and then I look up and it's like midnight. I'm like, oh my God.
But I think though, I mean, it's in some ways this isn't a surprise that people sort of go down this path because it speaks to the polarization that we see everywhere over everything. People don't have a basket that says true, false, and interesting if true. And I have that middle basket for me is just overflowing. And you can do a lot of good research on the internet. You can do a fantastic amount of good research on the internet.
Yeah.
But approach it with a jaundiced eye, look for corroborating evidence, consider the source, don't cite Reddit in your freaking book. Try to find the actual, source of what it is, the original newspaper article, which people don't do nearly enough newspaper research, or the book or whatever it is. But don't just take some forum post as evidence of anything.
Okay. We are about at time. Final thoughts is what we'll do. Instead of the usual commercial at the end of a panel. Josh, you got any final points you want to raise real quick?
Nothing that Dylan and Alex haven't said, just in yourself, just as eloquently. I think I know that reading is not for everybody, but really try to, if you're interested in something, try to gather as much information as you can and deliberately go into places where you are a pilgrim in an unholy land. Like, do that with your faith, do that with your interests, do that with your political beliefs, do it with everything, and find reasons why you disagree with it.
Perfect. Alex?
Yeah, don't be afraid to look up from the screen. I mean, the great investigators and researchers of, the Victorian era were able to come up with some really interesting thoughts and theories and found some really great data. And they didn't have the EMF meters. They didn't have, apps. They didn't have Ovilus. They didn't have the ghost box. And you can still have a great investigation using old school techniques.
Dylan, the final words going to you, my friend.
Thank you. What I would say is it's great that you are interested in the paranormal, but there are organizations out there. You've got the Ghost Club, which was founded in the 1860s. You've got the Society for Psychical Research, founded in 1882. They might be academic, but they've been there and they've been at the coalface for all that time. They have made all the mistakes. And you can get in touch with them and you can engage with them and you can learn a lot from them. And don't be afraid to ask them questions, because they're there to help you, make yourself a better investigator. Because if that's what you want to be, that's what you can do.
Perfect. All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you, Josh, Dylan, and Alex for taking the time.
Thank you, Tally.
Thanks, Tally.
We'll be back around with a couple more things over the next couple of days. Thank y'all and be safe. Night.
Good night.
Thanks.